Once you printed off your parts, I like to sand down the part where we're going to be sticking the vinyl so that it doesn't make a wavy surface. Then put the part down on top of the vinyl so you can cut it with a little bit of slack on both sides. Measure it up, make sure you have a little bit of space on both sides, then cut along the other sides. Again, leaving a little bit of extra. Use some isopropyl alcohol just to wipe down the face of it before you stick anything to it so you know it's nice and clean. Peel the film from both the front and the back. The front, if there is some. This vinyl does have a clear film on the front. Then I like to lay it down on the table and stick the part to it. Make sure the part's clean. And press it down. You can use a credit card or something like that to get bubbles out if you have any. I usually don't. Now you want to cut off a little bit more of the excess, and now you'll start cutting these corners like this. This will make it a little bit easier to fold those corners in. Give you a little bit more of a round corner. So just repeat this on all four. Now fold these edges in. They don't have to be perfect because once you heat it up, that's when the adhesive really starts to stick. So as long as it's just somewhat there, you're okay. Now grab a hair dryer or a heat gun and warm it up. Don't overheat it. It is just plastic. If you use PLA, the melting point is pretty low and it will start to warp. So be careful not to heat it too much. If you do heat it too much, try not to bend it. Maybe put it between a book to flatten it back out. But as you heat up the vinyl, it'll become a little bit more pliable and a lot more sticky. So you can fix these corners and get everything nice and flat or round. Once it's cooled off, grab a sharp blade, X-Acto knife, and start cutting out all the holes. The hardest holes to cut out are the screw holes on the back where we folded in those corners. I usually cut a small hole or just cut a square out on the back so that I can put a screw through. The rest of them, as long as your blade's sharp, it cuts pretty easily. Just make sure that it is cool before you do this. Sorry I didn't get more video of the inserts, but make sure you put in the M3 threaded inserts, and this is your finished box. Do a test fit of the lid to make sure it wasn't warped or anything, and make sure that the holes line up. And then I like to screw the lid on just to ensure that it does fit. Test fit works. Next, we'll upload some code to the Arduino. So if you've never done this before, download the Arduino IDE. You're going to get this joystick library, which we just downloaded. Then you're going to go up into the sketch here, include library, and add.zip library. Select the zip file that we just downloaded, and that'll give you the joystick library. Next, we're going to make sure in your managed libraries that you have the keypad library installed. It's version 3.1.1 is what I'm using. So just install that. Next, grab the code from my GitHub repository, just hit that copy button and then paste it in. Once we have that pasted in, we're going to select our Arduino. So make sure it's plugged in. Be sure to use the Leonardo, not Pro Micro. If you use Pro Micro, you'll have to reset the Arduino and it's a big pain in the butt. So select Arduino Leonardo, select your Arduino that you plugged in, and then hit upload. The output will look like it has some errors. As long as the output is similar to what you get here, it works fine. First, I want to go through a few of these diagrams on how the Pro Micro will be wired. We're going to do a 4x4 matrix for the buttons, so that gives us a total of 16 buttons. With this button box, there are only 14 buttons being used. And for the images here, I used momentary switches for all of them. However, you can imagine that these are the rotaries that have switches in them, or the toggle switches that we also have included. Total of 16, we're only going to use 14. A3 through A0, those are going to be our columns. We have column 1, column 2, column 3, column 4, so 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then we have rows 1, 2, 3, 4 that go along the x-axis here. Every time there's an intersection, that's where the matrix can have a switch being activated. For 1, 1, that would be this button, or for column 3, row 2, we'd have, okay, let's take column 3, this one here, and then row 2, that would be this button here. So that's where they meet. Each button has a unique point of entry, and that's how the Pro Micro knows which one of these is going to be registered. Now, moving on to the rotaries. The rotaries also have the clock and signal, I believe is what those two pins are, if I remember correctly. And then you also have a ground. On the left-hand side here, we have our momentary switch pins. In the last diagram, we talked about those switches. That's where you would wire the column and row. But right now we're talking about the signals for the rotary. So when you spin it left or right, it needs to know where it's at, which direction it's going, things like that. That's what's happening here. And then you have a reference to ground. It does not matter necessarily which one goes to which, like the top pin going to 2 or the bottom pin going to 2, whatever, that doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that you do pair them with 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. If you tried to tie this rotary on pin 2 and then its other pin to pin 8, that wouldn't work. That's how those are wired. And then the ground, you will just connect each of these grounds and then go to a ground pin on the Arduino. You can also link that ground to another ground that leads to the Arduino if it makes it easier for you. That's what I usually do. We'll go over that in just a minute. Now, this is how the wiring for the columns will essentially look. We've got row 1, 2, 3, and 4. So row 1 is going to start. This is if you were looking at the back of the button box of the lid. You'd have your main rotary on the left. So if you flip it over, it'd be on the right for those that aren't shape turners. One pin for the rotary here, and then you daisy chain this connection down to the next button, daisy chain it to the next rotary, daisy chain it to the switch. And then column 2, we follow this line here. So we start with, like for this project, it's the engine start button, chain, chain, chain. Same thing for the next column, chain, 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 and then the last column, chain, chain, chain. Next, we have how the rows work in contrast to the columns. Something that's very important here are the diodes. Just remember which way that the diodes go. You want it to go positive to negative towards the Pro Micro. An easy way to think about it is to tie them in with the negative, the cathode, going towards the wire. Row 1 going through that top row, then the second row, third row, fourth row. Now for a more realistic view of what the rotary wiring is going to look like, you will follow the 2, 3 up to this top rotary here. And then 4, 5 goes to this far one. 6, 7 goes to the middle. 8, 9 goes to this one here. And then your ground here needs to, well, it's easiest to tie these all in together and then lead back to a ground. This is one way that you could do it. You could tie to this ground here or the grounds on the left-hand side of the micro board. That works just fine. Another option is, since the engine start-stop button and the switch that I chose both have lights in them, you could tie these grounds all together. And that's what I do. I try to make the grounds as short as possible. So whatever your shortest path is for each of your rotaries, and then you take the last ground and you daisy chain it up to the ground pin. Either, it depends where you're sharing the ground. I share mine here on the engine start-stop button because I use a connector, which you'll see in my soldering video. That is a very easy way to get these grounds all connected. It's all going to lead to the same place, and then you'll have your 5 volts for the engine start-stop here. One thing I did forget to put in here is a resistor. Make sure you get a resistor. I can't remember the value that I used here, but I can add it into the description. But just put a resistor on the voltage line for the light that's in this button. Now that we understand the diagrams, let's start soldering things together. I just pull a nice long line, trim it up. You can use really anything between 30 AUG up to probably 22. The larger your wire, the more difficult it can be to get around places, but also the more sturdy the wire will be. I use 30 AUG here, and frankly, I feel like it's a little too flimsy, but it does the trick. So here I'm soldering all of the grounds for the rotary encoders, and then I add some heat shrink to each of those. Just be careful when you're heating up the heat shrink not to overheat the plastic on the other side and the vinyl. The vinyl will warp. And daisy chain all of those grounds together. And then, like I talked about in the diagrams, I do tie this into the ground that is connected to the engine start-stop light. So this is probably the most important part that we want to touch on, and that is the diodes. So with the diodes, we want current to flow from positive to negative, so coming from your column through the button towards the Arduino Micro on the row. Without these diodes, if we didn't have them, then anytime you trigger more than one switch, there's a possibility for the flow to go through the other switches and make it think that another button is being pressed. These diodes are so important because if you don't have them and you try to activate, say, your 4 toggles and then press a button, the toggles alone might start already triggering other buttons that aren't actually being pressed. Using these diodes is so important, or you're going to have all sorts of ghost presses from your other momentary switches and possibly even your rotary encoders. When you're installing the diodes, make sure that the cathode, the negative side, so that solid line, is pointed towards your wire when you're soldering them in, or rather that it's going back to the Arduino Pro Micro. Follow this diagram as best you can. Conveniently, I found this online and it has 4 and 4, so that it works out great for our purposes, but as you can see, the diodes, the cathode is going towards the beginning of the row. Here we have a picture of what the Zener diodes look like. So the negative side usually has the black line there, so positive to negative. And here I have them installed, so you can see the positive side is closest to the switch, negative going out. So these will be where the rows are daisy chained. So first I'm installing the columns. And just for simplicity's sake, I tie everything back up to the top. That makes it a lot easier for me to use the ProMicro panel mount. You can panel mount the ProMicro into the box. That file is also included in my GitHub and on Thingiverse. That was, I'll give credit where credit's due on those as well. They were remixed a little bit to fit the ProMicros that I have that are the USB-C. But it's a very simple design, works great. So here I'm tying in the ground from the rotary encoders to the ground that's going to connect to the engine start stop, and I'm using a fast on connector. I have a ton of these sitting around from arcade projects. This is what the wiring looks like when it's done. The yellow is the rows, the blue are the columns, so you can see how that works. And then I feed everything up through the bottom of the board, give it a little bit of length of wire so that I can get it mounted. And then one by one, I just cut off the top, strip a little bit of wire, or a little bit of the sleeve off, and solder it in place. Once that's all done, you can go to this gamepad tester online, plug in your Arduino, which you've already flashed, and start testing out your buttons. We have a few options in the code that we can enable and disable. First, we have half step. If you're using half step encoders, uncomment this line to enable the half step encoders. Most of the encoders that I've found online are not half step, so you can leave this commented out. The next line is enabling pull-ups. Comment this out if you're using the rotor encoders that have a circuit board attached to them, which have their own pull-up resistors. I don't recommend using those because it can make for a little bit more work. Not only soldering, but also the ground for the rotary encoder side is tied to the momentary switch side of the encoder. So you'll have to sever that connection with a knife or something like that through the circuit board. So I don't recommend using those, even though a hardware pull-up resistor is nice. It's just not worth the extra work. Here we're including our libraries, the keypad and joystick libraries. And here's where you can make some changes. So if you make some changes to the button box, or if you're trying to use this code for a button box that isn't the one that I've provided the files for, you'll need to make some changes here. You can change the number of rotaries, you can change the number of rows and columns for your matrix, and you can change the total number of buttons. Make sure that this number of buttons is actually going to line up with however many rows and columns you set up, and make sure that you can actually fit it on the Arduino Pro Micro. If you're following the guide for the button box that I've created, you're pretty much full up as far as your pins go, other than the TX and RX pins. However, I don't recommend using the TX and RX pins because those are used for serial communication. So they could interfere with the USB communication between your computer and the Arduino Pro Micro. You could add in some extra bits just by triggering your encoders or buttons or switches. I would not use those. Next, we have the map of our buttons. This has a new variable that is called buttons, and it is a collection of the number of rows and number of columns. So if you change the num rows, num calls, and num buttons, you'll need to change this. So as you can see, this is a 4x4 matrix, starting with 0 through 3 as our first 4, and 0, 4, 8, 12 on the y-axis. Next, we're defining what pins are being used for the rows and columns. Now on this image on the right, you'll see the Arduino Pro Micro has A3, A2, A1, A0 using this diagram, you can see what those labeled pins actually line up for as far as the numbers go. By default, we're using 21, 20, 19, 18, 15, 14, 16, 10. Next, we have this struct, which is a blueprint for how a data set is going to be defined. The first two properties here are pin 1 and pin 2, so you'll define those. Then you'll define the counterclockwise and the clockwise charge. So that is saying what button is going to be pressed when I rotate it counterclockwise or rotate the rotary clockwise. What button is going to be triggered. And then next we have the state. So whether it's on or off, whether it's being triggered or not. So now we have this variable rotaries of type rotary encoder, or this collection rotaries of type rotary encoder. So this is a collection of rotary encoders of these structs, and we're saying how many we have, and that will be defined here. So we have 4. So the first encoder is going to be using pin 3 from the Arduino as its pin 1, and pin 2 from the Arduino as its pin 2. It will trigger the 16th button and the for the counterclockwise, and the 17th button for clockwise. And then we're setting the state to off. So similarly, the second one, pin 5, pin 4 is 1 and 2 for that, and then it will trigger buttons 18 and 19. That is about it when it comes to things that you should or could change if you're making your own button box and you want to set up this code for your own button box. A couple other things you might want to be aware of. The default number of buttons is 32. We're only using 24 total here. So if you want to use up to 32, you can. If you need to go higher, make sure you adjust this in the joystick constructor. You'll also want to adjust what buttons are being triggered in your button map, and possibly your pins that you're using, and possibly the buttons in the rotaries if you do change these. The other thing to be aware of is that there is a list max. This is a default in the keypad library. If I remember correctly, the list max is 10. If you have any further questions on the code, how it works, or just any explanations of anything, let me know in the comments. I'd be happy to help you out.